Brian. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining our webinar today. Our webinar participants are coming in here very quickly as we go, and we're ready to roll here. I'm Brad Lubben, Ag Policy Specialist with the Center for Ag Profitability here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. You can always find an archive of our past webinars as well as a schedule of our upcoming webinars every Thursday on our website at cap.unl.edu. Today, we're talking about farm income, and particularly recent farm income projections that have come from USDA's Economic Research Service and from the University of Missouri's Food and Agricultural Policy Research Institute, provide a baseline for farm income projections in the United States. They also provide a foundation for work at the state level. And the Rural and Farm Finance Policy Analysis Center at the University of Missouri is collaborating with the University of Nebraska to extend that analysis at the state level to Nebraska. And we have Nebraska farm income estimates to share with you today and an outlook to share as well. So I'm pleased to have Scott Brown, Director of the Rural and Farm Finance Policy Analysis Center at the University of Missouri, join us today to give that perspective of a national influence on the farm income situation and outlook, and an introduction to the collaborative work that we're doing with RaFF, as the acronym would be called. And then we'll talk about farm income situation outlook here in Nebraska before we wrap up with questions and answers and discussion with our audience. So thank you for participating. Scott, welcome this afternoon, or this morning rather. Well, this afternoon now. You and I joined just before noon here while it was morning, but welcome this afternoon. Welcome to our webinar. Thanks for participating, and we look forward to your discussion to get things started here.
You bet, Brad. Thanks very much for having me on today. And I appreciate the chance to visit a little bit about, I'm going to spend my time kind of at the U.S. level, but as I start, I want to give a shout out to all my colleagues at Missouri that work on the national side. So FAPRI, of which I've been a part of for the past now 35 years, is certainly been in this forward-looking baseline business for a long time. And they've done an August update, or we've done an August update almost annually ever since I would have started. I also have a website that's more focused on livestock and dairy numbers as well, amap.missouri.edu. But having that as the starting point, I think it really works nicely now to say, you know what, we're going to talk about expanding that, if you will, now and having the opportunity to partner, Brad, with your group at CAP as well as RaFF, I think really offers a good opportunity for us to work together and begin to learn a lot more. So the national farm income numbers that I'm going to talk about today certainly paint the overall picture, but I think there's a lot of finer points that can be better illustrated as we start going around and picking up these individual states. So we appreciate the chance to work with you all today. As I start, I just say it's amazing where USDA gives us net farm income for both 2021 and 2022. When you realize that we're talking about what was $140 billion of net farm income in 2021, and USDA now suggesting a slight increase for 2022. What a phenomenal time. And I will say, when you think about our very initial pieces of discussion when COVID first broke, I don't think we would have been talking about necessarily record farm income. And yet, as we're recovering from some of those COVID issues, it seems like things are generally good when you look at the farm income side. But I want to point out some of the risks that concern me at the national level as we look ahead. And I start here and I'll say that the numbers that you see on this chart that are in the boxes represent the change from 2021 to 2022. And number one, we have seen cash receipts that have gone up all nearly $100 billion. When you look at that in historical terms, that's quite a impressive jump. Yet the thing that I think I'll drill down on at least a few times today is total expenses are also up a lot. I don't know an input that has gone down in price in the last couple of years as supply bottlenecks, labor shortages, energy costs all have added to the bottom line here. So 66 billion gets taken away in that nearly 100 billion in cash receipts. And yes, on top of that, you look at government payments and the projection is for them to also be down as well. So although in net we're up in that projection about $7 billion, according to USDA for 2022, that cost risk is certainly one we want to talk about. So as I spend some time at the US level here, I start by looking at production expenses. In particular, I'll focus on those energy related expenses, and you look at total production expenses according to USDA, and up about 75 billion, and again really driven across the board with increases. As you look in front of us, the forecast that FAPRI's put together for the next 5 years here suggests some reduction in expenses, but we never come close to the level of production expenses that we would have had, say, over the 2016 to 2019 period of 350 billion. So they're stubbornly high in terms of not being able to see those production expenses move lower. On the receipt side, a few things I'll say here. Crop receipts to begin with. You look back at where we were in 2013, where I kind of talk about the peaks. It took us 2010 to 2014 to roughly get the increase that we've seen from 2020 to 2022. Higher feed grains, food grains, oil seeds, all the other crops up as well. What a phenomenal run, and that plus $450 billion of cash receipts is a record level. When you look at the forecast in front of us, so we'll say crop prices will begin to moderate as we look ahead. That's conditioned on average weather, both in this country and around the world, and many other assumptions that may or may not play out at the end of the day. And another one that I think is important is, just no future additional outbreaks of war beyond what we have going on between Ukraine and Russia. And we certainly know there are a number of other hotspots that could prove that assumption to be wrong as we look ahead. Equally on the livestock side, I'll say almost the identical thing is happening where from 2020 to 2022, we saw almost the same increase that it took us 2010 to 2014 to happen before. I will use this graph to remind myself that back in 2014, I might have called this the second golden age of agriculture back then. Little did I know where we would set in 2022. As we look ahead on the livestock side and those cash receipts that FAPRI has projected of late, a few things to me stick out. So number one, you'll notice red meats, and I'll say particularly cattle here in this case, actually continue to see an uptick. And I think if we looked at hogs versus cattle in this case, we would see cattle receipts are going to continue to go higher. Yet poultry, dairy, those other receipt categories are slowly working down as well, is the projection that we have. So less receipts, and now all of a sudden, you put that all together, and number one, I'll say we're north of $700 billion in cash receipts today. Phenomenal record level, but both, again, crops and livestock, FAPRI baseline will suggest for the next 5 years we get a little bit of moderation in those as we work ahead. If we spend just a few minutes talking about the important pieces of the crop outlook that drive those cash receipts for things like corn and soybeans. I will just remind us that stocks are projected to remain, fairly tight. We got some soybean stock data out recently that maybe suggested a few more stocks, but I'll say generally tight. I think that increases the odds for more variability ahead of, or volatility ahead of us, but also potentially higher prices. So although on average we'd suggest prices will move down over the next 5 years, that doesn't mean that we couldn't still see some upward movement as well. I remind us that part of that is poor weather that's occurred in the U.S. and other places as well, and then just world events. The Russia-Ukraine situation has certainly added to the outlook uncertainty that we have. And we always have competitors, with South America being important to that market. So indexing all those crop prices to get them on one slide for a minute. I'll spend some time here on the yellow line, corn. I think that's going to be important as we talk maybe a little bit more about some of the Nebraska specific events. Fapori's projecting the 22-23 corn price at a $6.35, but by 2027, that gold line falling to $4.37 is the price being projected. Similarly for soybeans, a $14.25 roughly soybean price for the year that we're harvesting right now, falling to $11.22. Wheat, similar. So declining prices, and I think that's, again, important for us to be saying out loud, especially against what's going to be production expenses that continue to move higher. I look at yield estimates, the red being the places in the country where it's not quite as positive. And again, corn yields and deviation from the 30-year trend are the underlined numbers, while the bottom ones or the underlined number are soybeans. I look at Nebraska, and from the September data from USDA, 7.5 bushels less corn relative to the 30-year trend, and 13.5 decline on soybeans. We've got some other parts of the country that's done fairly well, so it's been a mixed bag. Drought is certainly important in terms of what we're talking about in terms of the current situation. I will say, when you look at who's been changing, who's been declining in terms of 2022 corn production, a 30 million metric ton decline in the United States leads the way. The EU also being down a little more than 10 million metric ton. Ukraine also shows up as a more than 10 million metric ton decline in corn production. Those are the three that in my mind have been leading us to tighter supplies. We continue to see, again, places like Brazil and Argentina increase in corn production. Well, if we talked about US, EU, and perhaps Ukraine not declining like we've seen of late, maybe that, again, gets us some lower prices. Maybe a graph I'm going to have spent too long making for the relative value that we have here, but it's not chronological from left to right. So it's from lowest stocks to use ratio to highest. So on the very left side, 2012, we had a stocks to use ratio of 7.7%. Whereas on the very right-hand side, on this side, we have 2017 with a 15.1. I just want to make the point that when we're tighter on stocks to use, we have a much larger range in monthly corn prices that we see, or we tend to have it that way. The red star that you see here is what USDA is telling us for 2022 in terms of stocks to use and price. I just remind us there's opportunities for higher and lower prices around that range as we go forward. And this idea that we should expect more volatility, I think is important to the picture. On soybeans, here's more soybeans in 2022. Brazil certainly leads the way with more than 30 million metric tons of additional soybean production. The U.S. Is actually for 2021 going to be down slightly relative to 2021, down slightly, but a little different story when we talk about soybeans in terms of overall global production. The same stocks to use graph as I showed for corn, again, showing that volatility range. It's not as apparent in soybeans as it was in corn. But I think the same thing still exists of we could see a lot of volatility in soybean prices moving forward. Spending just a few minutes talking about cattle markets. You can't talk cattle markets without uttering drought in the first word. And I think Brad will certainly share more detail about Nebraska, but I know there's certainly some difficulty in Nebraska in terms of what's going on. We're going to get big declines in beef production. If demand stays as strong as it's been, I think we get some very large price increases. Demand has stayed very strong thus far, so I'm not suggesting otherwise than strong demand, but the risk set there of inflation, what are we doing as we continue to see higher interest rates pushed at consumers? We tend to talk about fairly high food prices at consumers, so is there some demand risk? What happens to drought in particular as we go forward? It seems like that's been driving things, but just like on the crop side, input prices have been up across the board. When you look at our kind of forecast for the next couple of years in terms of both fed cattle and feeder cattle prices, very high, near record highs. I sometimes joke to audiences that, they're back to almost 2014 levels. And I always say even Scott Brown could have made money in the cattle business in 2014, I believe. So it could be a pretty good period as we look ahead. It's just amazing how much weather has affected us there. When you look at prices for on the livestock side, again, indexed, you'll notice this is frankly where cattle sticks out relative to some of the other prices. We expect, for example, milk prices a couple dollars, $100 lower in 2023 and continuing to work their way down. That may work for the dairy industry if our projections of feed costs also follow that downward projection. But cattle in particular, going up almost every year for the next 5 in the projections that we have from August. The cow herd, we're likely by January 1 of 2024 going to be below the U.S. level that we had back in 2014 of 29 million head. You look at the July 1 data, we were down 2.4% relative to July of 2021. So all looks to be headed in the direction of fewer cows. You look at cow slaughter, you look at heifers in feed yards, all of that data tells me we're going to continue to contract as we look ahead. And just to make the point, all right, so states from left to right, biggest states to smallest states, Texas to Arkansas, in those top 10, that's about where 60% of the beef cows in the country reside. So you want your state not to have bars that stick way in the air. The bluish to the right set of bars is 2022 year-to-date percentage of hay and pasture in D1 or worse. Texas has certainly seen some tough times, Oklahoma, but I remind us Nebraska is sitting there with 80%, much above the left bar, the gold bar, that's the 2000 to 2019 average. So dry areas in many parts of the country. That's on top of then what was a 2021 more dry area than Northern Plains, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana really leading the way there. So it's not a one and done. This has been a drought that continues to expand, and I'm going to be curious to see what happens as we go into 2023. I stopped by, just reminding us about the headlines here. So the corn supply and utilization tables are tight, could lead to higher prices. Fewer cows certainly are leading to more production in the short run, but 2023 likely leads to production declines that we haven't seen since 2014. You have to go back. 2004, I believe, was the next year where we saw the kinds of decline that we've going to experience in 2023. We continue to run the risk that receipts for ag commodities move lower, but we can't get production expenses to move downward. I will say, to me, the strongest headwinds generally are just what's happening on the inflation front and general economy. It's been a tough economic year. We see a lot of signs of concerns about that. And if demand for our ag products were to wane in the U.S., that probably doesn't lead to such a positive outlook in front of us. I close by just reminding us to make sure that we do a little bit of risk management. So I look forward to the discussion, Brad, and I'll turn the program back over to you.
Scott, thank you very much for that larger picture nationally, and also recognizing many of the issues, you're right, that do play out here in Nebraska for sure. Just a reminder before I open up and as I start my presentation here, you see a chat box that will tell you, please enter any questions you have. We'll address those here after the end of the presentation. You can use the Q&A section of Zoom to submit those questions, and we'll try and address them here as we finish our discussion. I hope that you're seeing my title slide here and our discussion of the situation and outlook as it applies specifically to Nebraska. I note here on the title slide, this work on Nebraska specifically is a collaboration of the Rural and Farm Finance Policy Analysis Center at the University of Missouri and the Center for Ag Profitability here at the University of Nebraska. So I've got, of course, the N on the title slide. I have to have that, right? Lots of red, have to have that too. But there's also this little black and gold logo down there for MU. And we greatly appreciate the collaboration and the work here to expand RaFF's reach to more states, starting here with Nebraska. So that's the introduction to what we're doing. The question of where we go from here, and this is a slide I've been carrying around for a few months, and so I'm going to start with it just to mention, don't forget lots of issues. We're going to talk about farm income, but I'm also an ag policy specialist by sort of by vocation first, and a risk management specialist as well. We're going to focus on a lot of issues here that relate to the income outlook and the farm bill debates coming ahead, and always the policy outlook is a bit uncertain. All of those contribute to some of the uncertainty we have for farm income prospects now and looking ahead over the next decade. But specifically to talk about Nebraska net farm income, RaFF published a farm income report for Nebraska. RaFF, in collaboration with the University of Nebraska, published a farm income report that was released last week. It's available on the RaFF website, and it points to a Nebraska net farm income number that actually exceeds $8 billion again for 2022. We hit a record level just above $8 billion in 2021. Those are numbers, estimates officially, mind you, but those are numbers estimated officially by USDA's Economic Research Service in their September 1st report of farm income estimates. So we hit $8 billion, and I guess I should take 10 seconds to say, I actually projected an $8 billion farm income in Nebraska last spring when we were trying to massage the outlook and the numbers as best we could. The fact that we actually hit it within a few million is pure luck. But we did in fact hit $8 billion here, a record farm income for Nebraska, a record on nominal terms, certainly. Look back to the data and you'll find that 2011 and then 2013, we had previously hit record highs above 7 or 7.5 billion. Now we're talking about $8 billion record farm incomes, substantially above where we were in 2020, and certainly above the just over 2 billion that we saw in the low of 2017. So the fact that we hit a record at 8 billion last year, the fact that we nearly matched it with projections here currently for 2022 is a really strong signal of the ag economic strength in Nebraska and the solid financial position. That hides a lot of the disparity that we're going to see with conditions that we had this year. And I want to mention those in importance here as we go along. But in an aggregate level, a strong number for Nebraska. And as Scott alluded to with the national implications and national results, this is a growth in both crop receipts and livestock receipts. It's substantial growth over 2020 and it's continued growth over 2021. So crop and livestock receipts that almost match each other at between 15 and $16 billion of receipts here in 2022. A strong income signal for Nebraska producers. Now, on the crop side, that's a mix of some yield challenges, but higher prices. On the livestock side, where beef cattle alone represent 90% of livestock receipts in Nebraska, we're talking about increased marketings in spite of a shrinking cow herd, increased marketings this year and higher prices that have given us this growth in receipts. So think about those two numbers, close to $16 billion apiece. Just think about the components of the crop side. The largest revenue crops in Nebraska: corn, soybeans, wheat, and hay. Not all row crops here. Hay certainly has an important component here as well. If you're talking about production numbers in terms of acres, some of that's off slightly. Wheat was a little bit up in terms of total acres here. Hay harvested acres is down substantially, and that could be drought influenced certainly this year. You're talking about a yield per acre, and mind you, this is not cognizant of the full impacts of drought potential here or drought concerns in Nebraska. This was based on the August numbers that went into FAPRI's updated baseline estimates and then RaFF's updated baseline estimates for Nebraska farm income. So recognize that this is an analysis sort of effective of an August outlook. And in August, those numbers were for a corn yield that was down around 7% relative to 2021. A soybean yield down around 13%. A wheat yield that certainly was well known, maybe not finalized, but well known and down dramatically from 2021. And a hay yield, a much sort of more difficult estimate to make perhaps, but a hay yield that was down substantially as well. So production generally down across the board rather dramatically, but prices also much sharply higher. Total value of production, a little bit mixed, but then total receipts as well. Stronger in corn and soybeans, a little bit weaker on wheat in spite of substantially higher prices, and weaker on hay given the total lost production. Now, note there is a difference between value of production and receipts. Value of production is a simple calculation of actual production times this estimated price, which is a Nebraska equivalent price estimated for the production year. But value of production is then adjusted for home consumption, which is a very small element, and then adjusted for inventory changes. Think accrual adjustments to inventory. With higher value inventory expected to be carried out at the end of 2022 relative to the start of 2022, that means that the receipts might be smaller, but value of production actually was a little bit bigger by comparison. So total receipts, generally speaking, up for crops in general, and you see where it comes from. Higher corn, higher soybeans in spite of reduced production. Livestock production, higher receipts as noted in Nebraska. I mentioned all of that, nearly all of that comes from beef cattle and calves. Total receipts up around 19% for cattle and calves in Nebraska. Hogs and pigs were up in spite of some, a little bit smaller marketings. Dairy, specifically, we're talking about milk production. Dairy had substantial price increases. And in poultry, specifically with statistics on egg production, we're talking about dramatic price increases. Now, dairy and poultry are not small components of Nebraska farm income, but all of those numbers really do pale in comparison to the beef sector. I should also note in poultry, we're talking about a number here that is specific to egg production. We do see numbers for turkeys. We do see numbers for broilers. We don't know that fully represents the growth in broilers that we've seen over the last couple of years. But even at that, eggs have been the dominant share of the poultry sector here in Nebraska. And we'll see that continue to grow over time. The poultry sector is growing over time, but still, livestock is really driven by beef receipts here. Now, crop receipts are up, livestock receipts are up, but as Scott noted, so are farm expenses. And if you separate out all of the categories of expenses into intermediate expenses That includes the purchased inputs like seed, feed, and fertilizer. That includes purchased feed, purchased livestock, fertilizer, fuel, and other purchased inputs, chemicals. Intermediate product expenses are up dramatically. And you can see where we've gone over really the last 50 plus years. Labor expenses, interest expenses, other overhead expenses, those have also risen over time. They don't share the same sort of degree of impact on the bottom line that the growth in expenses, particularly as we note those purchased inputs, feed, animals, and fertilizer and energy at the top of the list. So those are the expenses that are driving the bottom line up and driving the cost of production line up and hurting Nebraska's farm income bottom line. One of the other factors that is actually pulling the bottom line back down a bit is the reduction in government payments. Total government payments here over time really peaked out in 2020 at nearly $2.5 billion in Nebraska. But more than 80% of that $2.5 billion came from ad hoc payments. And I see part of my categories didn't show up here on the heading, unfortunately, in this graph. But that dark brown or dark reddish brown color, those are supplemental and ad hoc payments. Those are the disaster assistance program payments that include some of the authorized programs that respond to drought and death loss, but they're primarily ad hoc government legislated additional assistance. It really grew. It started with trade assistance in 18 and 19 that was paid out in 19 and 20. It mushroomed with COVID relief in 2020 that carried into 2021. And now in 2022, we do have some additional payments expected, but we are certainly shrinking fast and far from those previous levels. So if you try and sum all those together to think about where net farm income is in the state, in 2021, around $8 billion in net farm income in Nebraska. Well, crop receipts went up, livestock receipts went up, crop insurance indemnities, those are net indemnities, went up as well. But then production expenses are higher, which pulls net farm income back down. Government payments are down substantially, pulling net farm income down. Add in all of those other changes as well. And lo and behold, we end up right back at $8 billion. Technically, we're a few million less in this projection for 22 than we were for 21, but effectively unchanged for the year. This graph comes straight out of our report. I note that Ryan has put in the chat box a direct link to the report. I said it's on the RaFF website. It's also on our CAP, our Center for Ag Profitability website for you as well. Now, that's what we see through 2022. Best projections that we have of where we are today and what we expect for the year. We'll see final numbers officially published by USDA's Economic Research Service in September of 23, and we'll have official numbers for 2022. But this is the projection that we would see based on what we know today, and technically based on what we knew as of the August outlook that was incorporated into the analysis. To go a little bit further and look over the horizon, however, we extend those numbers out in a few graphs here to 2031, the last year on that graph. That's the 10-year projection looking ahead that RaFF produced in this collaborative work for Nebraska. That's based on the 10-year projections produced by FAPRI at the University of Missouri as well. So like Scott demonstrated with a few of those graphs that look out to what's ahead for a few years, this is what's ahead, or at least the projection what's ahead for the next 10. The current projections would tell us that 2023 might continue to be a strong year based on marketings and receipts, but recognizing even still a shrinking role of government program payments as we gradually trend back towards some longer run average. Those receipts show up, crops could dip back rather quickly from the highs that we see today as market prices tumble back towards longer run equilibriums. Livestock receipts look like they'll be higher, and I noted that's predominantly beef, and Scott's price charts noted that beef prices are projected higher as we go through the bottom side of the cattle cycle. So receipts could be stronger for livestock, expected to pull back on crops over time here. But then expenses, relatively flat at best, maybe with a little bit of increase in some categories, pulling back a bit from where we are at the moment here in 2022, but not offering necessarily long-term relief from higher expenses. And that's the same category as I showed on the earlier chart. If I focus in specifically on fertilizer and fuel and electricity, the energy components here, fertilizer pulls back, or at least we could say it's projected to pull back, and we hope it pulls back. But if we think and wonder about crops sort of returning toward a longer run equilibrium after some adjustment here, after working through tight stocks and getting back to equilibrium, we're also wondering the same thing about energy and what that means for fuel and fertilizer particularly. I don't know what the longer run equilibrium looks like for energy. It's in my mind, now remembering I'm the policy specialist without a market focus here, but it's easier to imagine a longer run equilibrium for commodity prices than it is for energy right now. And so the challenge here is we may deal with these higher prices for a longer period of time than we deal with higher commodity prices as well. So that's the outlook in terms of the expense side. The outlook in terms of the government payment side. In 2022, government payments look to be pretty minimal, with very little, if any, commodity program payments, with about $140 to $150 billion of conservation program payments, and with another 300 or so million of potential emergency payments. That includes the emergency relief program and the livestock emergency relief program payments that are expected to roll out here in 2022. But if that weans away in the form of ad hoc payments, and we don't predict ad hoc payments going ahead, that isn't to say they won't happen, but we don't predict them, then there's very little in the government portfolio other than a growing conservation program portfolio. And as a chat question has already noted, what's some of the money in the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, that's pointed towards agriculture, substantial dollars pointed towards conservation, translates into a projected increase in conservation payments over time. But otherwise, very little looking ahead until the later years here of the decade, when if prices fall back towards a longer run equilibrium, then commodity program payments may again become substantial. But that's the challenge that we see at the moment here, adjusting to maybe declining crop prices, stable livestock prices, declining government payments, and still higher expenses, a challenge to margins here in the coming year. Now, I say this chart would show us that there are essentially zero commodity program payments in 2022 and 2023 looking ahead. I want to give you an example of ARC and PLC payments on the 2022 crop that we're harvesting right now, and projected those are payments that would be made in 2023. If you look at where we are currently with projected market prices, and this is as of USDA supply and demand reports from WASDE in September, we are at prices far above where the PLC program would trigger. It would take 40% or more losses in price to trigger payments for our 4 primary program crops. The likelihood of prices falling, the season average falling 40%, is essentially nil. And so the projected payments are essentially zero. Now, compare that to ARC, given that prices are up and substantially above the benchmark that goes into the ARC calculation, at trend yields or benchmark yields and projected prices, it would take much more than a 40% revenue loss, even more than a 50% revenue loss to trigger ARC payments. So we really don't expect to see any ARC payments as well on the 2022 crop that's paid next year, with the caveat that a 50% revenue loss on the 2022 crop is unfortunately more likely than a 40% price loss. Given where we are with drought conditions, and all of the state is in some level of drought conditions, and some of the state has been in severe and extreme drought conditions, having better than a 50% yield loss at the county level is unfortunately likely to occur in some of our non-irrigated practices. So I won't doubt that there will be counties that in fact trigger ARC payments under the unfortunate production circumstances we have. That isn't the same as saying that all producers would get an ARC payment, because payments are still blended at the farm level between irrigated and non-irrigated practices. And so irrigated yields may effectively subsidize or protect the non-irrigated practice. But suffice it to say, we don't expect much in terms of farm program supports in 22 or for the 22 crop paid in 23. Unfortunately, it is likely to trigger in a few places. Now, one final slide to finish up, going into some discussion here, is a little bit of economic humility here. And this looks back over time. If you took the actual price movement for corn prices in the black line there, and a dashed line leads up to the 2022 projection for the moment of, I believe, 665. Compare that to all of the other lines in that chart, which are baseline projections, just like we're talking about a projection for the next 10 years. These are baseline projections from USDA, and then here in 2022 from FAPRI. Baseline projections for what's ahead for the next 10 years. And if you try and read that chart, it would suggest that the baseline projections are never very good about predicting price movements. My joke is that economists are very good at predicting straight lines. If you tell us where we're at, we can predict a straight line based on long run trends that gives us some direction for where we're going for the next 10 years. Now, that's not to throw models under the bus. We have a very good reason for working on these models to give us a baseline of what's ahead. And the 10-year projection is valuable. In the close years, certainly much more even than the longer run. But the one thing that these baseline projections can't do is predict shocks. And we've been living through enough shocks in the last 4 to 5 years that having a very confident picture of what's ahead is a challenge in and of itself. But that's the perspective of where we think we're at with Nebraska farm income and what's ahead for the state. I'm going to invite Scott to join back again. I'm going to stop sharing, and we're going to look to address some questions if you have them. All right. So we do invite questions here, please, to join via the chat box if you can, or rather the Q&A box if you can. I did actually address the one question about money going to agriculture in the IRA. Specifically, I mentioned the increased spending that's proposed for conservation programs, and the trend analysis that I saw, and Scott, you could confirm maybe the FAPRI numbers sort of predict as well, right? Substantial increases in conservation payments over the next 10 years.
Yeah, that's correct, Brad. I don't disagree with you at all on that front.
Another question that's come in: with commodity prices projected lower, and they may stay elevated, right, for a time and working through tight supply and demand conditions, but if they're projected to return towards a longer run equilibrium, and I would add, if commodity prices move towards a longer run equilibrium that's a bit lower, and at the same time we have expenses that don't look like they're adjusting as quickly, then what's that mean for land prices?
Yeah, so I jump in, and I wish, Brad, I knew the answer to that question. I could probably make a lot of money by getting in land markets potentially, but I will say I think that takes some of the shine off the increase we've seen over the last few years in terms of land values. Just when you say higher production expenses and then lower cash receipts, I'll add the other piece of this ingredient that I think is important, and that's just where do interest rates go here longer term? As we continue to see adjustments made by the Fed trying to curb inflation, to me, that could take more shine off of and potentially drive land values lower in the years ahead. Maybe there's more risk there than there is right now in terms of where the relative returns are to some of these cropping enterprises. So I think we have a lot of factors that, if we talk about getting to much tougher economic times and higher interest rates, to me, that's the more troubling. And I don't want to overstate. If you look at the FAPRI baseline, it's by and large showing flat land values being projected over the years ahead. I think that's the trend. Of course, things like weather matter in all of these discussions a lot, other macro events, but we're going to have to watch.
Scott, I like how I'm looking at questions and I'm looking to you for all the answers. So I appreciate that. There's one I'll take a stab at and also get your comment on as well. But recognizing all these numbers that we presented are nominal. They're not in real inflation adjusted terms. The first question relates to, or the first part of that question relates to, if adjusted for inflation, then the net farm income really isn't heading higher, it's heading slightly lower. And I would note, when I showed Nebraska farm income projections, I talk about a record $8 billion level. Well, on inflation adjusted terms, that doesn't beat the $7.5 billion of a decade ago. And it certainly doesn't beat the farm income levels of the 70s and the 50s and so forth. So on inflation adjusted terms, you're right. We're not talking about a record. We're talking about a recent high point here. But Scott, let me add you into the discussion there of what gives us a better picture. And I might also ask cash income versus official accrual based income here, and then real versus nominal, which gives us a better picture of how agriculture is really doing.
So I'm not sure you can just narrow in on one of those, so I will say to the real versus nominal, very, very clear in real terms, we're not at record levels. But I will also say we've become much more efficient over the last several decades at what we're doing. And so it gets a little hard to compare very easily those things. So I should probably be more careful about when I talk about 2022 being record, it is in nominal terms. I just, again, will say, I think when we look at 21 and 22, they far exceeded expectations, probably, especially when we set in March of 2020 with the worst of COVID upon us. I think no one was projecting the kinds of increases that we've seen. I'll just say more volatility ahead. And if you ask me to give you my risk assessment, more downside risk pressure than upside potential. And I hope I'm wrong when I say that.
Scott, we have a couple of livestock questions, and that taps directly into your expertise. One of them relates to high path avian influenza. What has that done to poultry revenue in general, and what sort of challenges and risks do we have relative to that?
Yeah, so I think high path AI could certainly come back and be an issue again this year. We're already starting to see some signs in some parts of the country. So I often answer this one as an economist. So demand for many of our ag products, including poultry products, are inelastic. But when you have these kind of disease events happening, and it reduces supplies, we tend to talk about total revenue going up. Now, that's in total. For those that are having the high path AI issue, they're worse off. But industry as a whole, when you have fewer supplies, you'll likely drive that total revenue higher. So it all depends. This is no different than a drought discussion in some ways.
Yeah, I was going to parallel that and say the same sort of reality here. If we talk about higher crop receipts in Nebraska, that sounds good in aggregate. And we recognize that we're also dealing with major drought concerns, which means that some producers particularly with the tools of irrigation, may have relatively good yield levels. We even worry about the heat that we've had, and maybe those yields aren't great either in some cases, but at least stable to good yield levels at much higher prices is a very good return. And the producer without irrigation that's lost half a crop at 20% higher prices still doesn't make up the difference. So aggregate revenue is up, but even more maybe dispersion between the haves and the have-nots in terms of how it plays out.
Yep.
So, all right, the related, or at least the other livestock question of note is, what about beef imports from Brazil, particularly here? Could beef imports grow to the point that our upside potential on beef prices isn't as strong, or at least isn't unlimited?
Well, so I think the basics of that question should remind us that when we're going to potentially talk about record prices because of dry weather in this country, the incentive for others to try to push more beef to us is going to go up. All else equal, I think we get a little more beef imports than otherwise would be the case. But I would argue beef is not beef. Product from places like Brazil isn't going to compete with the kind of products that we're going to put on the table here in the United States. So I think there's some limit to that. So in a ground beef product, could we get more lean coming in from other parts of the world? Yes, I think that's still going to be the issue. And sometimes I'll remind us that lean product coming in makes our fat worth more than it otherwise would have been. So this whole import discussion is important, but there's many facets to it. I just don't see Brazilian beef being a great substitute for what we're producing here in the U.S. So I'm not too worried about what happens in terms of that beef coming from Brazil.
Well, Scott, that then sort of reinforces the argument that the beef imports, while it's interesting to see beef exports from the U.S. and beef imports into the U.S., the beef imports, at least from South America, are more complementary than they are competitive, right?
Yeah, I would argue that's the case. And again, I will say to the whole mix of this discussion, when you look, we've tended to be a net importer of beef in quantity terms, yet a net exporter in value terms. I always will say the industry wins when we get the opportunity to go service those higher end markets like Japan, Korea, these days partly China, and I think we want those markets, and again, we are certainly a net exporter in value terms, and we've been seeing substantial value this year despite what's already higher prices as countries continue to be interested in U.S. beef products.
Scott, another question here. Maybe we'll both attempt it, but given what we've talked about, given what we look at or looking ahead at, what are your recommendations? If you were a farmer, what would your crop and livestock choices be for the next couple of years?
I'll let you go first, Brad.
The question on the crop side first, if you think about what the right crop mix is, we think of the corn soybean ratio as a pretty good indicator of when it's time to switch the sort of the traditional rotation. And in spite of the differences in price outlook or some of the production cost challenges, particularly for energy intensive inputs like fertilizer, more so on corn, that ratio finds a way to keep the rotation generally in line. It takes a big swing to convince you to abandon the rotation one way or the other. While we'll see shifts at the margin, I don't know that it fundamentally shifts production patterns very much in terms of the crop outlook. Maybe if prices fall back faster than inputs do, than expenses do, then we have to get more creative and think about a different cropping system, or at least a lower, maybe a lower, less intensive cropping system. But I don't know that current price projections suggest a dramatic shift in cropping patterns.
Yes, I would certainly agree with you on that front. I guess I would say it's nice to see maybe some new demand coming on the soybean side with things like renewable diesel. Maybe that factors into a little bit of this outlook about what do I want to plant in terms of traditional commodities. But Brad, you hit the nail on the head. It seems like we get all these crop prices moving together enough. It's hard to get too far out of what's a normal rotation, and growing something new, a crop that you haven't grown before. Maybe that's a good strategy, but you better be as good at growing that as you were at growing corn and soybeans.
Yeah.
Now, I will say for the cattle side of this equation, there may be an opportunity. The problem is there's risk in taking this strategy. I think we get higher prices. We can argue about how much higher they get, but I might want to do some price protection like I haven't probably done as a cattle producer before. And that's both thinking about cattle prices with things like LRP insurance, but also PRF insurance as well. So the pasture forage rainfall product may provide some risk against, because if we continue to talk about dry weather, and I think some of you sitting in Nebraska are in a different situation than some states, I don't want to go into 2023 and repeat a drought like we come through without having some risk protection as best I can get it.
Scott, I would second that as well. That it's one thing to think about what do prices tell us about the right enterprise choice in the mix, and as you noted, some growth here and potential soybean crush capacity and demand. A couple significant plants proposed here in Nebraska as well that could drive soybean acres higher over time, over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. I would anticipate that bites into more continuous corn acres. It doesn't motivate someone to go continuous soybeans. So we might see a shift in some of that balance, but it'd be where a continuous corn acre gives way to a rotation. But then the more immediate question is, well, what do you do for the coming year? How can you manage that risk? Effective pricing, effective insurance decisions have to be part of that question. One of the new innovative insurance tools that's not really fully tested yet, and one of the ideas that's being talked about for farm bill discussions is relating to, can you manage margin risk instead of just output price risk, or instead of just output yield and price risk. The margin products are available on a pilot basis. They cover input costs, fertilizer, fuel, and interest from a period of fall through planting time in the spring. And then they cover yield and price risk from spring through harvest. Well, the sales period, I believe, is already come and gone here for the 2023 products, because that fall input pricing period is already here and gone. So maybe the opportunity is already past us, unless it's October 15th. I don't remember the right deadline, but it's either come and gone or it's quickly closing to think about a margin product for the coming year. But certainly you want to think about managing both input costs and output risk as well. So I think we have exhausted the questions, Scott, or at least the questions we have for the day. There may be more forthcoming here. As I said, I offered a little bit of humility there at the end to say it's really difficult to predict futures, or the future. It's really difficult to predict shocks almost by definition. But the baseline analysis gives us not so much a prediction of the path ahead, but a baseline to understand where shocks will move us over time. And so a final word, Scott, about the collaboration and the modeling that happens down at Missouri in both FAPRI and RaFF, and where we go from here.
Yeah, so I'll just add, I always say, if I was really good at this price projection stuff, I wouldn't be on this webinar today, Brad. I don't know exactly where I would be, but would have made lots of money. I do think those long-term baselines help us with direction. And I don't read much more into them because of the assumptions of average weather, of not big macroeconomic shocks. Those are some things we're going to have to deal with along the way. So let's get the trend and figure out, how do I want to do risk management relative to what the forecasts are saying or the baselines are saying about what's ahead. As I close, I'll just say it's been a great chance to begin to work together. I feel like what we're doing in RaFF with you all at CAP provides an opportunity to drill further into these national farm income numbers to really say what's special about Nebraska or Missouri or other states that from a policy perspective are important to note, because one size policy may not fit all as well as we would like. And so I believe the collaboration that we're starting here between our two organizations provides the opportunity to illuminate, as Congress thinks about the 2023 Farm Bill. And to me, that's going to be the win from this whole process that started with the formation of RaFF just a little over a year ago.
Well, I thank you, Scott, for joining us today. Once again, Scott Brown is the interim director of the Rural and Farm Finance Policy Analysis Center at the University of Missouri. The collaboration between RaFF and the Center for Ag Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln is hopefully the start of something substantial here over the coming months. We'll likely be back at this again in about 6 months when there is a new baseline update in February or March, and an opportunity to discuss again where we can explain why the predictions we had today were wrong, but that we'll have better predictions then, right? Something along that lines. Right. But I thank you all for joining us today. Remember, as always, a recording of this webinar is also available. It'll be posted along with all of our past recordings at cap.unl.edu. You can also find information there on our upcoming webinars on our weekly series that we conduct. As you leave the webinar, please look in that chat box. There was an opportunity to click a link to fill out a brief survey. We appreciate survey responses that help tell us how today went, but we also appreciate survey responses that give us your ideas and your preferences or recommendations for future topics as well. So having said that, thank you very much for participating. Scott, again, thank you for participating and joining us today. I wish everybody a good afternoon.